This afternoon. At this time, we'll open up for questions of Common Cause and Susan Lerner. My first question to you would be, I believe we have about 6 legislative days left in this session. Do you see that if there was really a willingness to create an independent commission that can still be done?
Unfortunately, because we have not seen even the submission of the bills to the appropriate committees to move through, it does not appear that there's a willingness to live up to the pledge that Senator Sampson mentioned. Along with our colleagues at Citizens Union and the groups that have formed the coalition Reshape New York, we have been calling our members and voters in districts across the state of key senators who have signed the pledge and have done nothing. And what we found is the constituents are concerned about the fact that there is not movement on this bill and that the pledge was signed and is not being honored. When we talk to people about this in districts across the state, what we find are people are alarmed and they want to see action. As we know, at the end of session, there are ways to get bills passed if there's a will to do so. And it concerns us greatly that this is a process that does not seem to be moving forward in the way that it should be.
Hey, thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, Susan. One of the ways that this may develop is either, well, the various scenarios are either the Senate majority reconsiders and actually does what they said they were going to do, or if it doesn't, there's a good chance this all ends up in court after gubernatorial veto. And one of the things that I think would be productive, if it came to that, would be for others to show how simple it is to draw fair maps. And I know that's something Common Cause is considering. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing in that regard?
Yes. We are committed to drawing what we believe will be a set of fair, non-political maps. We've invested in the software. We went to our members and said, the software that the legislature uses is not cheap, but we think we ought to invest in it so that no one can say, well, you're using some different way of doing things, your maps aren't really comparable. So our members came through and they sent in the money specifically to be used to allow us to license the mapping software, the basic mapping software, and the specialized software that LAT4 uses to draw maps. We're working with concerned citizens, a relatively small panel of people who are advising us on issues specific to their area, and we expect that sometime in the fall we will come up with a suggested set of maps which will follow the criteria that we believe need to be followed, that it respects one person, one vote, compliance with the Voting Rights Act, respecting communities of interest, and it's an interesting process on how we're going to figure out what those communities are. Traditional redistricting factors like contiguity and compactness, and importantly, following an incumbent blind process. And we will be coming up with a set of maps, and the reason why I asked Brian to join me is that he's the person who's going to have the primary responsibility for drawing those maps that we hope to be able to disseminate and to ask the public to provide feedback for us so that we can adjust it and to show this is an interesting process, but it's not a magical process. It's one that, especially now where the technology exists to allow you to draw sophisticated maps, if you put in a reasonable amount of time and effort and you understand the factors to be balanced, you can come up with what we believe will be a fair set of maps. So we want to illustrate to the public and to the legislative bodies that this can be done. It's not magic. It's not something so specialized that only legislators themselves can do it, and that there are alternatives. And if, unfortunately, this lands in the courts, then hopefully our maps will stand as an alternative. But we also want to be showing the governor that if the legislature does not reform the process, and I'm not willing to say it's impossible, even though we're close to the end of the session. I'm an optimist, that's why I do good government work. So I'm not willing to say that independent redistricting is dead. But if at the end of this legislative session, whenever that is, we are stuck with the current gerrymandering process. If Lat 4 repeats what we believe were the missteps of the last redistricting cycle and comes up with a set of very politicized, incumbent-friendly maps drawn through a closed process, we hope to show the governor that there are alternatives and that he does not have to accept the maps that the legislature has drawn, and that he can send them back and say to the legislature, there are other ways to do this. Here's an example. We're not going to, I'm sure that the maps we come up with are not going to be perfect. There is no perfect map in redistricting, is what we've learned. But there are better maps and there are worse gerrymandered maps. And what we hope to provide is an example of a better, non-politicized fair map.
Thank you. We've been joined by State Senator Gustavo Rivera, the Bronx. In order to encourage public participation, we have received our first question from the live stream chat. And I will ask the question of everyone, and anyone who would like to answer the question may do so. And the first question is from Pooza87. How do you deal with districts like Assemblyman Riley's, which has many large towns in it that can't be broken up because of the state's constitution? Does anyone like to answer that?
Well, I think that it's the process of redistricting is a balancing process, and that's why the question of communities of interest are very important. When I've gone outside of New York City and in neighborhoods in New York City, people are very willing to tell you where the commonalities are. So in rural counties, when they point to the districts, they'll say it doesn't make any sense that this particular township, where people are of a socioeconomic status that's more similar to a township that's in another district, that they're not in the same district. So I think the inquiry is, what are the communities of interest? What are the similarities between the different towns, the different areas, and try and group those together. And I think that is part of the art and the science of drawing a fair map, is learning from the people where they believe their centers of interest are. And that, I think, is the first inquiry. There are other guidelines in terms of compactness and contiguity that we try and adhere to, but we can't just take a ruler and come up with straight lines. We've got to be mindful of where these communities of interest are and try and do a better job of really grouping townships together in a way that makes sense to the people who actually live there and who have shared interests.
Right. Is this on? It's important to remember that a gerrymander is not just about the geometric shape. It's about the people that are within those boundaries.